That is exactly what the church is called to do, to walk by that kind of faith. So let that stay with you all week. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. Well, we're going to kind of talk by walking by faith today. And we're going to begin with this chapter, Hebrews 11, and it talks about halls of fame, actually. And you're familiar with halls of fame. Sometimes they're actual halls, or they're museums or trophies. A hall of fame consists of names of people who have accomplished something. They're noteworthy. They've made a significant contribution to their industry. And usually there are lifetime achievement awards and things like that that are all tied together with it, accompanied by ceremonies that happen. Sometimes they are maintained the list by an organization. Sometimes a city has their own hall of fame. For instance, basketball coach Sandra Meadows in Duncanville. There's the high school basketball stadium named after her, named after a person that was in the Hall of Fame as far as we're concerned in Duncanville. There's automotive halls of fame, aviation and space, the arts, business. Every industry seems to have their city awards that are given. There's horse racing, there's music and sports, you name it. It extends a long ways, and you're well aware if you've ever visited a Hall of Fame. Have you? I have. Baseball Hall of Fame. Where is it? Oh my goodness, there must be more than one. It's in New York, it's in Cincinnati. Okay. Texas Rangers Hall of Fame over here. Okay, we have a claim to fame. Well, the Bible also has a Hall of Fame, and you heard the story. It's the Faith Hall of Fame. It's right there in the New Testament, and it includes people from all over. There's some pictures that point them out. Noteworthy people of faith. Abraham, because he followed God's voice. He followed it again and again and again over the years, even to the point of giving his son up to the Lord. Then there's Moses' parents who hid him because they weren't afraid of the king, the powerful king's edict. They knew it was wrong, and so they weren't afraid, and they did not fear it, and they did not kill their baby boy as ordered by that edict. And that was Moses' parents. Moses, because he left Pharaoh's household where he was a son of a king to identify with his own people who were in bondage to that very king. And he did that because he wanted to identify with God's people. That was reason he was in the Hall of Fame. He relentlessly confronted Pharaoh, who would not let Israel go, but he stuck with it. He went back again and again and again until they were let go. Israel's faith, when they left the land of Egypt and they had to cross through the Red Sea. Now, how would we have handled that if we were standing at the edge of a sea and asked to walk through with raging waters? How would we handle that? That was reason for Israel to be in the Hall of Fame. Joshua, as he led the children of Israel into and surrounding Jericho and asked them to march around that city for 7 days. How would we have done? I can hear a lot of arguments and murmuring. Had it been us, I'm not sure those walls would have fallen. Then there was Rahab for receiving God's spies in peace. Why did she receive the spies in peace? She had heard about the God of Israel. She said, I'm going to be on that team. And so she hid them, and she protected them from the people who would destroy them. And so she's listed in the Hall of Fame. And this is only the start. So let's read further. And what more should I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. Now, what were some of the qualities of the people who are listed in the Faith Hall of Fame? It behooves us to discover that. So let's look. First of all, they took risks. And when they heard God's voice, open up opportunity, they took risks, and that led to gain. This is a way of faith. They were, think of Abraham. He believed God. It was counted as faith. Moses identified with God's people. He could have been called a traitor. The second, be defiant in the face of opposition and wrongdoing. Moses' parents defied the king's order. They refused to comply because it was wrong. Moses insisted that the king let Israelites go. They wanted to go worship their God. He insisted. They were being oppressed. Rahab did not betray Israel's spies to the authorities. She hid them. She was willing to stand up in the face of oppression. Third, move forward into the unknown as led by God. Think about it. Abraham moved to a new place he had never heard of. He had never been there. Then the people moved forward into the riverbed. They had never been there. Joshua led a strange and uncommon attack. It was not your normal warrior's mode of operandi. Number 4, unity among followers. The people moved forward into the Red Sea together. The people marched around Jericho together. Abraham's family followed the vision of their ancestor for generations. It wasn't just Abraham, but it was Abraham's extended family. It was Abraham's children. It was Abraham's grandchildren. It was his great-grandchildren. All that family moved and followed that vision of faith. Number 5, leadership with vision and commitment. God's leaders did what they asked the people to do. They didn't just state what to do and stand on the sidelines. They moved as well and did the same. Moses identified with the people. He didn't rule from a position of power. He was with them. Abraham never gave up. Never gave up. All those years of praying, and years later when he was put to the test, he had years of building of his faith and trusting God, and years later he was able to give his son to God without hesitation, putting God first. That's leadership. Joshua saw the goodness of God, and he kept saying to the people, this is good. This is a good gift, a good land. And he encouraged the people to see it in that light and to move toward it. So these are the 5 points of faith. These are what it takes to be in the Faith Hall of Fame. Today is Independence Day, when the leaders of our country declared their independence, declared the 13 colonies together would be free from the British crown. And this is how they started their declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All of us in this room could probably say that, right? By heart. We've heard it a lot. Notice that this is a statement of faith in the Creator, the God of heaven and earth. It's a statement of faith. That's what they believe about God. So how did our founders access those elements of faith evident in Hebrews 11. So we're going to examine the founding of our nation this July 4th. It's rare that July 4th falls on a Sunday, and preachers get to talk about this. So we want to learn how faith can move mountains. We want to see the experience of our nation, and when we realize the efficacy of faith, then perhaps faith will grow and move our actions too, that we can continue in that vein. In the late 15th century, and we have to look at a little history here, don't fall asleep, okay? Governments in Europe began to change. There had been a feudal system, and it began to change to a more centralized system of government, to centralized nations, with France kind of taking the lead, developing. England, Spain, and Portugal all emerged during that period of time. It was an age of discovery and innovation. It was there were lots of gains in trade. There are reasons for this that we probably don't want to stay here and hear about right now, so you'll have to read up yourself. So there were gains in trade, there was gains in traveling, there was changes in ship designs so that ships became more efficient. There was navigation, there were map making, there was wealth building. All of these things kind of converged and began happening at this period of time. And port cities actually grew, and commerce increased, and people were changing. And all this served to unseat monarchies and individual rulers that were in control of various areas. Like if you think of Germany, you go visit there and you'll see castles where there were rulers over different provinces, and they had their own knights and their own armies, and all of that began to crumble at this time. So that's when Christopher Columbus came on the scene. He was an experienced sailor. He was determined to find a route to the east. He was finally, even though he was Italian, he went to different governments. They rejected funding his trip, but he finally found one, Spain, who was going to sponsor, agreed to sponsor him. And you know the story, right? You've all heard it. 8th grade history, right? Surely you know all this, more than me probably. So you sail east and you find the west. That was the key. Sail east and you will discover the west. Or was it sail west and you'll discover the east? I think I have it backwards. It was sail, you know I'm not good at geography. Yes, sail west, you'll find the east. Christopher Columbus was a man of faith, and he was determined to press on, even when his crew nearly mutinied, because they had been at sea for 30 days. And that's what he thought was about the length of time. But there was no land. But he knew, because he had calculated the mileage from one of the books of the Apocrypha, and he had calculated the mileage, how far it should be, and so he stuck with it, even though his crew tried to mutiny. And a few days later, they found land. And it was great. He led his crew in prayer every 30 minutes. They had a half-hour little sand time thing. What are those called? Hourglass. And, you know, something about this makes you forget words. So they would turn that hourglass and they would state this prayer every 30 minutes. And, you know, you're out in the middle of the ocean, so that's what they would do. He led them in that. They had vespers every night. He led them in those vespers because he was a man of faith. Who are you leading in your business, in your relationships, in your family, into trusting God like that? A regular, committed connecting with God. Who are you leading? That's what he did. When Columbus finally reached America, he saw 4 rivers flowing, and he thought he had found the Garden of Eden. Isn't that cool? He never knew where he landed. He never knew. He went 4 times to the Americas, never saw it. But Over the next 325 years, the nation of Spain sent some 15,585 missionaries to the Americas. And so the act of one man impacted a nation. And for all those years, Spain sent missionaries. Faith took action. Faith takes action. How is your faith taking action in your daily life? Well, the church changed at that time too. While all this other stuff was going on, it was just like this huge upheaval, and the upheaval created conflict and persecution in the church, and people began to seek religious freedom. But times were tough. As of 1624, here in America, despite 14,000 people migrating here to Jamestown, Virginia, after they began in 1607, but as of 1624, there were barely 1,000 people there. And you know about the Pilgrims. When they came to Plymouth, they lost 50% that first year. People died. People died of starvation. People died of disease. It was a risk. There was hazards. Not everybody survived. Remember, where is it? Others were tortured, refusing to accept release. Others went through hardship. Others lost their lives. But there are things worth dying for. And so, in Massachusetts, Pilgrims were seeking religious freedom. And that started to kind of ruminate. And then Britain, because it was so far away, had no master plan, and each colony began to kind of formulate, develop self-government, and the distance made it almost impossible for Britain to do anything about it. And they couldn't rule. They tried, and they continued to try. And obviously, in a short sermon, I can't replay history. So, and you guys will correct me, I am sure, when I get out in that hallway about the things that I might be mistaken about. But that's okay. Because the more that Britain tried to intrude, the more that they tried to maintain control, and the longer the colonies got the taste of self-rule and religious freedom and some of those things they were wanting, self-government began to burn in their hearts. And after numerous conflicts, then Britain said, we're going to divide and conquer, and they closed the Boston Harbor. And as they closed that harbor, they also set other different limitations on the colonists. That the colonists were trying to control their legal and economic system, and the colonists began to resist. In fact, there were other colonies, when they heard that this had happened to Boston, rallied to support them. Think about the troubles of some of our cities. Are we rallying to support them? But that's what they did. They rallied, and all the colonies came together. And that was, as they came together to rally to Boston's cause, then they created a Continental Congress, and that Congress began to meet and represent the interests of all the colonies together. And then in September 1774, which is when that happened, it took this great faith for these people to do this. Great faith, because they had very little. They didn't have the world's goods. They didn't have any form of government so far. They were just people who had a vision and the faith to follow. They really had nothing at all, barely have homes. And go watch Little House on the Prairie. See how little they had, and think of a town like that rallying together to do something. And so they were going to stand up against the power of the greatest nation on earth. Here's one thing they did have. They had faith. God had seen them through to this point. And so they were building those experiences of faith that they still existed. And so their liberty was threatened, their courage rose, and then a profound shift began to happen. There was fear of being on their own. How would they ever conceive of that? But in early 1776, Thomas Paine wrote the pamphlet Common Sense, and that just began spawning the thought of independence in writing. The leaders wrote the Declaration of Independence not to stake out independent territories, but they wrote that. It was kind of a statement of self-evident truths, statement of beliefs that they had, convictions that they had been endowed by their Creator. And so let's look at what it took. It took taking risks when God opens up the opportunity. Oh, does that sound familiar? Taking risks when God opens up the opportunity. It took moving forward into the unknown as led by God. They didn't know. There was no template out there. They had to move forward. Be defiant in the face of oppression and wrongdoing. Unity among followers. Probably that should be number one. Leadership with vision and commitment. God gives freedom from bondage and unalienable rights to us. They can be realized when we commit ourselves to them and to acts of faith. That Declaration of Independence actually became a template for other nations. It is regarded as the greatest of all charters of human dignity and freedom. So there are other nations who have adopted it. But each generation has to live in faith. Each generation has to decide in their time, how's it going to be? Are we going to be together in this? What is our vision? How do we do this? Will we have the faith to do it? But living by faith is our call. God gives that to His church. It's a call that when we respond with faith, it can indeed move mountains. It doesn't start with the smart and strong. It starts with people who have faith. Because strength to God comes in our weakness. Faith is a confidence that what you hope for will actually happen. It gives you assurance about things you cannot see. And without faith, it is impossible to please God. For whoever would approach Him must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who seek Him. Happy 4th of July. Amen.